Well, welcome, and thank you all for coming today. It's a very daunting task to introduce Mary Miss. So I thought long and hard about what to say, but I think the key thing for us, perhaps, as we face challenges in our own community with the need for more public art, with the need for a stronger realization of the nature of the intersection of landscape and urban setting, the realization of the need for healing the land, in healing the connectivity between one part of our city and the different parts of our city. Mary offers a really extraordinary model. And the model is one of a hybrid practice, because Mary, as a public artist, has really redefined what it is that an artist does. And she's done this from the beginning of her career. At once sculptor, or at once somebody active, not just in the field of sculpture by any means, but also architecture, archaeology, landscape, urban planning, possibly even politics, in terms of trying to convince city governments to do what they'd promised to do and don't always act upon. So this hybrid practice is an extraordinary model for us, and one that we in Louisville need to take to heart, and one that we need to support among the artists in our region. We have in 2015 the Year of Environment and Sustainability coming up, the year of YES, and it's a year that we need to embrace, and we need to make sure that the artists in our midst have a large voice in that year dedicated to environment and sustainability. We live in a time in which there are extraordinary demands on us in terms of living what I might call authentic lives as opposed to vicarious lives. We get so much at second hand through the media, and Mary has been someone who's brought new sensitivity, I think, to that question, and helped us, as Aldo Leopold, the great naturalist, said, to be more perceptive, to embrace, as he said, recreational engineering, which for him meant learning how to perceive the landscape in a different way, and perceive our lives in a more authentic and realistic way, and point to the role of artists to show us the way to that more perceptive, fuller, richer life. Mary Miss. Thank you.
So I wish there was a way for this to be a conversation, and I know it's always hard when one person's standing up in front of everybody else to talk, to discuss things, but I'm really a practitioner who's trying to figure out a better way to do things. Caroline, Leslie, any of you who I've met last night, John, if you've got thoughts as we're talking about these things, please interrupt me. Any of you out there, if you're thinking about things. I started out in the 60s, late 60s, beginning to try and think about the role that artists can have in our culture. And during the 70s, there were so many public art programs that came into being, Percent for Art programs through the 70s, 80s, and on. There's only one problem. The very name of these programs, 1% for art, 0.5% for art, it doesn't give the feeling that this is anything too important. I think that the role that artists can have in our culture is an absolutely essential one. And so I've kind of taken on this task to try and convince cities that there is an essential role, not the frosting on the cake, not the first thing to be eliminated when any budget has to be cut, but that artists can really contribute something important, and that as we move forward into this very complicated 21st century, we have to find ways to communicate with our citizens, to engage people in dealing with all of these issues that we have to face. And artists have the ability to communicate on visceral, emotional, physical, psychological, so many different levels. Their means of engagement are so rich and complex that I don't think there's any question about, for me as the artist, now it's only, all I have to do is convince the heads of the Office of Sustainability or the Mayor's office that there is something important that we have to do. So I'm going to go through my history in a way to show you how I've been trying to rethink this, this issue. I would say that I was kind of going along in the way that I did for the decades leading up to 2000. You get your commission, you try and make it work, many times it doesn't work. You end up with a big stack of projects that maybe you worked on for 3 or 4 years that didn't happen, you get a couple done. But I live in Lower Manhattan, about 6 blocks from Ground Zero, and my whole life was pretty much turned upside down by that event being so close to the site. And after it happened, we had to start cleaning up our loft because all the dust had come in through the windows that were left open in the front and the back that day. But as soon as we had cleaned up, my assistants and I were just, in a daze and wondering what we could do. And we started to work on a project which we developed fully, and it was to do a temporary memorial around the perimeter of Ground Zero. And the idea was that there were all these police barriers, all these people coming down. The police barriers were up at 14th Street, and then they moved down to Houston Street, then they moved down to Canal Street, and then Chambers, where they stayed for a very long time. So basically, you're talking about a ring of police barriers that are kind of like sawhorses that carpenters use in New York City. I don't know what they're like here. So we said, let's replace these barriers with our temporary barriers, which we're going to make by stringing together plastic pipes and make them the same height, waist high as the barrier, 7 feet long. But we're going to make this, turn these police barriers into receptacles so that people could come and bring flowers and place them in the open tops of these pipes. And we had this image of surrounding the perimeter of Ground Zero with flowers for the whole time that it was being reconstructed. Now, the project didn't happen because there were such competing and difficult issues being dealt with. You couldn't get anybody's attention as an artist. But I think, first of all, I realized how essential this thing that didn't happen, how essential it was, that nobody was addressing all of these thousands of people coming down to the site. They were coming as mourners, and they were being put in the position of being voyeurs. And it was that there's a slight difference, that you're just watching what's happening or you're participating and you're able to express yourself. And so, number one, I guess, was this feeling that a major thing was being overlooked in this traumatic situation, and that artists really had a role that was being unmet, that needed to be addressed. But also it made me start thinking about how I operated as an artist. I sit in my studio waiting for somebody to send me an announcement of a 1% for art competition. I send my slides off. I get the competition and try and figure out how I can get my size 11 foot to fit into sometimes 3 different shoes, sometimes a really tiny shoe, sometimes a construction boot, whatever. They probably had nothing to do with my interests or my concerns. So I really started asking myself, how can I, instead of trying to turn myself and the competition site and situation into pretzels, how can I start addressing issues that are really important to me? Issues that are important to me, doing things in my own city, where I live, where I'm concerned about what's happening. So that's a bit of the story that you're going to see unfolding here. So in the early 80s, I did a project that was a collaborative project with an architect and a landscape architect called the South Cove, and it's along the Hudson River in New York. And I'd been living along the river for a very long time, but you could never get to it. So I wanted people to really be able to smell the water, hear it, see it up close, and did this construction that allowed you to walk out over the surface of the water without being on a private yacht or something. So this is the South Cove in Lower Manhattan. And this sense of trying to stitch the land and the water together was really an important notion for me. Now, I kind of expected, people will now keep asking me. I've done this. Everybody really seems to like it. People will keep asking me to do these projects because it costs several $1 million. I don't know, 12, something like that. Well, guess what? That was about the last time. Why, and why does that happen? Why, if you've done one project which is seemingly successful, but I think it was really seen as the architect's project or the landscape architect's project, even though I was the lead designer on it. So that's an issue. When you have artists collaborating, it's often they're not being credited for all that they're doing. And then a little while later, in the 90s, I did a project in Des Moines, Iowa for a demonstration wetland. And here I came to this site, and there was a derelict pond on the grounds of the museum, and I said, let's see if we can make people understand what a wetland is, how these little ponds work in the landscape. Almost all of the wetlands, or I don't know, 90% or something of the wetlands in Iowa had been drained so that people could farm the land. But as a result, these terrible floods were happening periodically. So we built a series of pavilions and walkways that people could get down and see the water from a kind of frog's eye level, or there was an elevated platform that you could get up and look out at the area. But it was really trying to get you to understand this place in much more detail. Now, I worked on this with a wonderful professor at Iowa State who was helping me understand all the plants that made this area up and how the wetland worked. So one of the things I felt as I finished this, I was physically and viscerally engaging people in a way that was really important to me, but it wasn't telling all about the place that I had been lucky enough to learn. Another project was done in Finland in the 90s. And in this case, there was a conference. This was a temporary project, and it was about our diminishing resources. So I did these series of troughs attached to trees that were kind of like giant reflectors on the trees, or mirrors of the trees. Again, the Des Moines project, which you just saw previously, was a permanent work, which unfortunately I think that people presume that art maintains itself. Even though it's on museum grounds, the piece has not been well maintained, and you see it and you realize that that's something really important, that art, just like bridges, homes, anything that's outdoors, really needs to have good maintenance. And then as in the, I guess, early 2000s, I was asked to come to the North Carolina Museum of Art, and they were building a big new building, which is being completed. And as you do that kind of construction, you have to deal with all the runoff water that's going to be coming from the site. And there was a crummy little pond down in the corner of the property, and they said, can you do something to handle this engineering issue that we have? And so I worked collaborating with a hydrologist to understand how we could take that water and clean it before it gets into the pond. And there are various ways you can address this if you're a environmental engineer, but I wanted people to be aware of what was happening. This notion of being able to decode the environment is really an important one to me. So I built a series, I was suggesting that a series of terraces be built. And one way of cleaning water is to send it through a green area, a planted area, but I wanted to take that kind of planting apart and tell people what it's made up of. So in those terraces, I was actually going to break out the different plant material so that you could see the different species of plants that were cleaning the water as it went to the pond. And then in order to kind of celebrate what was happening, this is an image from a dam in California, but it's to show this engineering device that allows water to kind of disappear in a very kind of phenomenal way. So to celebrate the water leaving that pond, I was going to include that, as you see in the, in the previous image, that just disappeared. So that was going to be kind of the culmination of this site. I think that any artist who works on projects has war stories, and in that case, my project was executed by a landscape architect without my knowledge, and is there today in a kind of slightly different form, but it's not a happy outcome, and especially when a cultural institution is overseeing something like that. So there are all of these issues that I'm trying to deal with as I'm going along, that you can't get things built, or somebody else ends up building them, or they're asking you to use a triangle in the middle, a little traffic island in the middle of a street, and transform an area of the city into a wonderful place on this traffic island. So I'm thinking there's got to be, a better way to think about this. And I'm wondering how long the train is. Do you have those ones that have hundreds of cars? Anyway, so I guess about the mid-aughts, as they, at least my father used to talk about with the early 20th century, the mid-aughts of the 21st century, I took about a year off to spend time thinking about a different way of doing things, and developed something that I call the City as Living Laboratory, Sustainability Made Tangible Through the Arts. And Peter, I really enjoyed your description of what's coming up in 2015, the idea of involving all the arts in looking at environmental issues in this city. My idea, I developed this with a colleague in Boulder who's part of something called Eco Arts Connections, Marta Kern. And she and I spent a good bit of time talking about how artists could look at economic, environmental, social issues, and really thinking about sustainability in the broadest sense, and how in collaboration with experts, with historians, or with ecologists, or with sociologists, how could artists begin to make these issues that are so important to us apparent to people in cities? And we kind of did, I think I had this sense that I was going to come up with this plan so that I could go into the Mayor's Office of Long-Term Planning and Sustainability and say, look, here's how you could do it. You could be looking at natural systems or infrastructure or social issues. Projects could be on a very small scale, or they could be up to a regional scale. And this is how we could begin to change cities. They weren't quite getting what I was talking about, but I decided to give them some examples. And this is a project that I had done in Boulder, Colorado, as part of an exhibition called Weather Report, Artists and Climate Change. And since I had grown up for part of my youth in Colorado, I knew that flash floods were a big deal and presumed that they were in Boulder. So I started communicating with some scientists there working for the U.S. Geological Survey. And in fact, nobody would think of a city like Boulder in the Rocky Mountains as being in a flood zone, but it's one of the highest hazard flood zones in the western U.S. because it's at the mouth of a canyon. And it takes only one rainstorm at the top of that canyon, and there will be a devastating flood in Boulder. This will happen. There are 147 cloudbursts like this every summer in Colorado. So it's just like, hovering. Will it hit at the top of Boulder Canyon? So the city, tells their citizens, hey, you should really be thinking about this issue. You shouldn't be building in this zone. Of course, the city's building the town library, the city hall, all of those buildings are in the flood zone. So, but I said, okay, let me work with the scientists here and figure out if we can project what that flood level is. And we put up 300 of these 6-inch diameter simple blue discs through the center of Boulder. And as you looked around, you saw this very constant blue line that sometimes was ankle high, but other times was 18 feet up in the air. The line was staying constant, but all of a sudden, by measuring your body next to that, you understood what topography means and what the this projected flood, which you as an individual have never experienced. It's not in your history, it's not in your experience, so how are you going to really believe that it's true? But this ended up being such an effective means of communication that the city left it, this very temporary project, left it in place for a year because they felt that they were finally able to get the message across to people. The head of the Department of Transportation in New York came to my studio not long ago, and she said, I want this project done down on Water Street in Lower Manhattan, because of course we've just had flooding as the result of Hurricane Sandy. And I was kind of, wait a second, Water Street's been devastated. All the businesses down at the South Street Seaport are completely wiped out. And I thought, I'm not sure this is the best time to do something like this. And indeed, her assistants came back later and said, yeah, we don't think it's such a good time. You could just see the business owners having the flood level marked out. So there are times and places when things are going to work or be effective that we have to consider. But that was an example of looking at something to do with natural systems, because remember I was saying we could look at natural systems, or in this case infrastructure, and this was a 30-acre sewage treatment plant in Arlington, Virginia that I was asked to do a project for. Now when I talk about shoe sizes getting mixed up, this was a perfect example. I was selected as the artist, and I'm sure the plant engineers who were on the committee imagined a big steel something in front of the entrance of the plant. And what I said is, look, the neighbors around this place, Al Gore at the time had a house up on top of the hill overlooking this. I guess maybe he wasn't complaining, but many of his neighbors were saying, we want this plant to disappear. This infrastructure that supports your lives day to day is not going to disappear. So I said, what would be really interesting is to make this piece of infrastructure into a public place that will engage people with the issues of water and how it's treated. So let's do a full-scale diagram of this plant. In the front there, you see that circular piece right at the center of the slide on the lower portion. That was an old digester which we were going to make into a public space that you could come to and start a tour of the plant. And in this kind of large-scale diagram that we were doing, we were showing the processes of step one or two or three of the solid waste treatment or the liquid waste treatment, so that people would understand how this plant was serving them. There were also, and here you see the inside of that digester that I spoke about, and when the water came out at the end, you were going to be able to see how effective this plant was in cleaning the water. Now, the idea here was that if people could understand how these plants worked, what they were doing, that they might lead their own lives slightly differently. If there's a heavy rain, these plants, or even not so heavy rain, these plants are overwhelmed and raw sewage ends up going into the water and into the Chesapeake Bay. Well, the plant this was part of an upgrade, a plant upgrade. They had a budget of plus or minus 40%. Do artists get a plus or minus 40% of it? On $400 million, and they went twice over, I don't know, it was something 800 million or something like that. So the art was eliminated, but I thought it was really a bad choice, because there are upgrades that keep having to happen for another 400 million, another 800 million. How can you get people to think differently and lead their lives differently, I think was a question worth addressing. I'm just pausing here. Is there anything that people are seeing that they would have any remarks about? It's hard to come in, but I'll keep pausing every once in a while, looking over to my table that I'm hoping to get some responses from. But just to show the last part of this, these kind of demonstration of the approaches, this was a project that was done in New Delhi, India, where New Delhi had this project to clean the air for the Commonwealth Games in 2012, closed down all the factories so they could get clean air. But what does sustainability mean at that large scale, looking at the city, and what does it mean at the local scale? In this case, it meant a very stable working class neighborhood was devastated because all the factories were closed at once. So I was saying, when you look at these issues, you really have to look at them at ground level. And so I said, how could we provide something for this neighborhood? This was a temporary installation. I got to choose this amazing old archaeological site. This area that you're seeing was filled with trash. I should have done a before and after picture. And I said, let's plant a garden of Ayurvedic plants. Ayurvedic plants are the basis of the Indian medicinal system. They said, we do not allow such things to happen on archaeological sites. And I said, garbage, yes. Plants, no. I don't quite understand, but let's think if we can do this another way. So I said, we'll do something that's like a tapestry, which represents a garden, as tapestries and weavings often do. And in the middle of each of those elements that we're laying out, we'll name the plant and tell what the use is in Hindi and English. And so we did that. We had this project up for about a month. And at the base of the pavilion, we brought the plants in so that people could see them. And we had speakers coming in to talk about the use of the plants several times over that period. And we had these portable parks out, about 5 of them out in the neighborhood, that shopkeepers would put out so that people would know when the talks were going to be happening. Now, this was really, it turned out a very interesting project in terms of the planners in New Delhi, because first of all, there are remains all over the city of just fragments. This is a very beautiful park that we're seeing, or pavilion in a park that you're seeing in this project, but there are little clumps of remains throughout the city of Delhi. And one question is, how could you repurpose those? How could you use them in a different way and not just have people coming to take the bricks to use to build the stone wall around their house or something? So having talked about this idea was fine, but people were, I did go into the mayor's office of long-term planning and sustainability in New York, and they said, how does this happen? What does this mean? We still don't get it. So I was lucky enough to have a chance to do a project in Indianapolis. I'd been working on a proposal that did not happen to make a walkway to their new Art and Nature Preserve, but Max Anderson, the director at the time, said, please come back and think of doing something else. So I thought, here's a chance to show what we're talking about with this approach. And I said, I was familiar with the White River, and one thing which runs through the middle of the city, and one thing that was always kind of notable to me was that this wasn't an active river in the sense that you would find one in Milwaukee or St. Louis or Cleveland. It was a river that I think the original settlers of the town, I had heard, said they thought it was navigable. I think they got there in the spring when the water was high. But since it's not navigable, it really has not been developed in the same way that rivers have been in other cities. So it's almost invisible. And yet it supplies 70% of the drinking water. This water is really polluted water. In the summer, there are blue-green algae blooms. I never realized how lucky we are in New York City to have our fresh water supply until I would be in Indianapolis in the summer and really not be able to drink the water out of the tap because of the smell of it and taste. So I said, let's see if we can get people to think about the river, even though it's not kind of been as visible as it has been than it is in other cities. Let's look at a 6-mile stretch, and I don't have a pointer, but from that little loop in the upper part of the slide, which shows the grounds of the museum, down to the center of town. It's about a 6-mile stretch, and I said, let's do a series of almost acupuncture-like sites along this route. And the idea was, you know, I've talked about decoding. I really love the idea of decoding the landscape. So I said, let's put a mirror up that people can see themselves in, and behind that mirror, let me try and go back, we'll put a marker out that's kind of like a Google map pin. I thought that was kind of humorous that you could actually get the Google map pin out in the real world. Let's say that the person will be able to look in the mirror, see what it is named that you're calling out, and they'd be able to align that mark with the map pin in the distance. So I could call out all kinds of things along this stretch of the river. And then there was a dial-up that was noted on the base of the mirror that people would be able to call and hear something about that thing that they were looking at. There is also a website that people can go to if they want to get more information. But one of the things that made this interesting to me was that when I first started working on the project, one of the USGS scientists sent me a disk and said, here's everything you want to know about the White River. And I put it in the computer, and he's a scientist. I guess this is really interesting to him, but I was like trying to keep my eyes open, you know, even after 10 minutes. It just, you know, it wasn't compelling to me in any way. A few weeks later, I was out in Indianapolis, and I started walking around the site on the museum grounds and then further south with this same person. And he started describing to me that here's where the water is infiltrating the embankment. Here's a fish hatchery. Here's the start of the levee. And as he's telling me these things, it's like somebody telling you about, we were having a conversation about their personal collection and the stories that come with the collection, with something about their children's lives. I mean, there was a story that was going along with this. And so I thought, gee, this is really interesting. I wish other people could have this experience. And that's why I came up with the idea of the dial-up. I didn't do it with a smartphone. When we started out, only 10% of the population had smartphones. We did it as dial-up. But what happens at each of these 100 locations along the river, you can dial up and hear somebody telling you this thing that the scientist had been telling me. So that there is this immediate content. It's not abstract. It's not just something that's being Googled on a web page. You're actually in the place and viscerally and physically understanding what's happening. So just to show you a few more images on the back of each of these mirrors, we indicated where you were along this path. Some of them were double, some were triple mirrors. One of the really important things was that it was a mirror, or it is a mirror, and you can see yourself in relationship to this, which I thought was really important. On the facade of the museum, we had these, I have a kind of subtle, sometimes, sense of humor anyway, but I thought it was kind of funny to put these big pox marks up on the facade of the museum. But when you looked in a mirror, a very large mirror in front of the museum, you could align the red marks on the mirror with those in the museum and find out about the 6 different water systems that were supporting the building. And then on the interior, for the first 6 months after the show opened, we had a very large-scale map that allowed people to understand their relationship to the river. The subtitle of the project was "All Property is Riverfront Property. The river starts at your front door." Again, the idea of trying to get people to understand their connection to the infrastructure that supports their lives. So that was one way that was really important to engage people. But we also did an app that allows people to track water from any place in the city, from their home to the river. And if it rains, they'll be able to see how the water's flowing. There are question marks along the path of the water that's being marked out, and it tells what pollutants are in that area. It tells what you can do to change what the state of the river is. So then the final thing is that we had a 10-day festival at the end of the project, or excuse me, at the beginning of the project, the end of my work, with speakers talking about various aspects of the river. We had performances by dancers. There were all kinds of things happening. Now, when we started out with this, we said, we really only want this to be a starting point. We want this to be something that will instigate other things happening in the city. Now, artists say things like this quite often and mean them, but you don't know if it's really going to happen. I've been really pleased to find out that since then, the Lilly Foundation has decided to do, they had a White River Festival again this past fall, and hopefully they're going to continue to do those. But also, there's a coalition of civic groups that's currently applying for a National Science Foundation grant, and they're going forward trying to mark the tributaries that lead to the White River, and I'm going to be working with them. But in other words, it isn't just something that you're saying that you hope will happen. The project is acting as a catalyst for future interest in and investigations of the river. This is early in the morning. It's kind of long. I'm just going to go through quickly a couple of big, complex projects. But one thing that's very important that I'm not mentioning here, money has dried up for the arts in many ways, and I'm really aware of that. And one of the interesting things here and in the project I'm currently working on Broadway is that I've gotten substantial support from the National Science Foundation and from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric NOAA Association. And I think this is not a free pass. The money to get these grants is incredibly difficult, but they are huge compared to arts grants. A small grant for the National Science Foundation is $150,000. $3 million is a kind of more average size grant. So it's something that's really important to be aware of. But the one thing that I would like to describe just briefly is a project that I did last spring with the Noguchi Museum and Socrates Sculpture Park. One of the things that's really difficult is how do artists get to meet scientists and the other experts to begin collaborations? And so I was asked by the Noguchi Museum to be one of 4 artists looking at Long Island City and the area, which is fairly remote in terms of access from transportation anyway, in Long Island City, but how this area could develop and develop in a different way than Williamsburg had, for instance. And so I said, what if you look at this area that we're going to call Ravenswood. One of the other artists looked back to how the area had previously been designated. But what if we start to look at this as a place where new ideas about the city could be looked at, that this could be a research district for artists and scientists and other experts to look at issues of sustainability. So I said, look, just imagine that you want to do something like turning the stacks of the Big Alice power plant into barometers to tell what the state of waste treatment is in the city, or water treatment, or how the air quality. If you could imagine these big stacks that you can see from all over the city as not only polluting but acting in some more positive way. Or what if we could, this is kind of showing how you could use all the above ground poles. No lines are buried out there. You've got all these poles. Why not designate this district, kind of borrow that banding of the red and white stacks, and let people know that they're in a research district, having places that they could go and meet with the artists and talk about different ideas. What if artists could do something like using the scaffolding and turning it into a green wall? Now, the trouble with any of these ideas, there are trucks all over. What if you could convert these trucks to biodiesel and make them movable studios where artists could work in this district, develop ideas, and then take them out to the rest of the city? All the blank walls of the city, how could those be reused and made in, have slices of park put up against them? The trouble with all these ideas is that the city is incredibly nervous because of insurance, because of liability. I mean, they can give you a laundry list of why you can't do things. But if they could see in a less central part of the city a place where ideas are tested, does that using scaffolding to make a green wall really work? Is it possible to build up against these flat blank walls of the city? I think that they could be more confident when the artist then suggests doing something in a more central location or any place else out on the streets of the city. So what we have in mind is creating a cultural trust that would be overseeing the artists and other expert collaborations, and acting as the go-between with the city, because believe me, for an artist to go directly to the city is a daunting task. So when I say I'd love to have a chance to talk with you about this, I mean, these are the kinds of things that I'm really curious about. You are the people who are experts out here in running programs. How could things be changed? How can you take a Percent for Art program and do something else with it? You have to be careful, because given the current fiscal climate, if you go back to City Hall and say, I want to change this Percent for Art legislation and how it's written, there's a good chance that it will be just eliminated. So how can we kind of creatively rethink what we have in hand and how it could be used? Could a percent agency become more like the provider of the services that this cultural trust I'm talking about could provide? And this was the district that we were talking about. And just briefly then, for a subsequent exhibition, we did a marking of the creek that is called Sunswick Creek, that formerly started right in Socrates Sculpture Park. We marked it. We had dial-ups that you could call up and find out about the history of the park, and there were these stopping points, multiple stopping points. And we worked with the writer Robert Sullivan, who did some really beautiful brief descriptions of the creek and what its presence still meant to the surrounding community. But again, just a brief description of where this has all led for me. I have said that I'm really interested in working in my own city, and I, about 2 years ago, went to the city planning board and was invited to do a presentation about the city as living laboratory, showed some of the ideas for the Indianapolis project, which we're still in development. And the head of city planning, Amanda Burden, said to me, "Mary, why don't you do something in New York City?" And I said, "Because it's too hard to do anything in New York City." But I didn't listen to myself, and I thought about it, and I said, okay, what if we did something, we've looked at the corridor of the river in Indianapolis, what if we look at the corridor of Broadway from the tip of Manhattan to the top of the Bronx? And try to imagine that this is going to be the place where people can come to see new ideas about sustainability in the city. And I would like to start this process by mapping the issues at up to 20 sites along that corridor. This was interesting to me as a corridor because it goes through all kinds of neighborhoods. You've got Wall Street, you've got Times Square, you've got the Upper West Side, you've got poor Dominican neighborhoods on the Upper West Side, way up. It's such a diverse and rich territory. So we've been working for about 2.5 years. I've been working really closely with some wonderful scientists who are incredibly patient at helping me understand the complex issues that are facing the city. We've taken the topics that Plan YC has laid out. My idea is really that these important issues that are being discussed between Department of Transportation and City Planning, the Department of Construction and Design, all of these people are talking about these things, but how do you get the citizens engaged? How do you start to get people to buy into these issues and not just think, okay, I'm recycling, that's enough, I don't have to do anymore? How do they begin to understand the importance of the infrastructure that supports our daily lives? How do they begin to become aware of their connection to the natural systems that support their lives? So working tirelessly, I have to say, on my studio and the part of the people in the studio with Department of Transportation and Parks Department, et cetera, we've come up with a kit of parts that they've agreed that they will let us use. These bright green poles that kind of establish a field that we're looking at, convex mirrors that show the city in an expanded way with a disc juxtaposed with that mirror, excuse me, which tells you something about what the mirror is focused on. We would like to do pavement markings that give you information. We find that people are really, if you tell them that, you know, their water's coming from A or C or D, that's fine, but people really can relate to equivalencies or quantifications. In this case, we're talking about how much sewer pipe is underground. But here you see how these discs work. Somebody said to me, who's not enthusiastic about the project in city government, said, "But Mary, I saw one of these tests you had up, and somebody was putting their lipstick on in this mirror, and do you think this, I mean, what good are you doing?" And I said, "This is really cool. That's exactly what I want." Somebody stops to put their lipstick on just by accident. This person was interested in infrastructure, and they get to find out something, at least hear something named. So here are just some images of tests that we have done. One of the things that we did at a test that we did about a year ago up at 137th Street, which was supported by the National Science Foundation, is we had a day of a number of people coming and talking. Eric Sanderson, who did a wonderful book about the history of Manhattan, starting from the actual physical ground up and what used to be there, was talking. Gwen Bright, one of the history detectives, was there. And we just had these great conversations with this complex and diverse audience that was in the neighborhood at 137th Street. Some Spanish speaking, so we had translators there, some college students, some of the newly arrived what used to be called yuppies. It was really an interesting group of people. One of the things that we did was invite the artist Heather Hart to do a project, and she said, let's do a recipe exchange. So we came up with a recipe for paella. We developed Broadway bling, which I wear constantly as the good luck that this project will really happen. And if somebody would give us a recipe, we would give them Broadway bling and our paella recipe. So we collected a group of about 100 recipes that we hope to be able to distribute sometime in the near future to that neighborhood. Food was an important issue, food accessibility. So this was Heather's way of thinking about how to get the neighborhood in having access to better ideas about how they might be taking their food in. So the idea with this corridor, though, is not that I'm going to do some permanent work and that this solves all the problems. This marking of these 20 hubs with the poles is intended to be a temporary installation up for less than a year. And the idea is that over a period of time, incrementally, that corridor would be transformed with other artists and designers doing projects along it. Things as small as a composter or as large as a new building and the kind of green roof they have. But anything that's done is not going to be done blindly, and when I say blindly, in terms of how it communicates with the public. The idea is that the building has to say what it's doing. You have to know that there's a green roof there. The composter has to be engaging people in a different kind of way. So there is this sense of trying to imagine a permanent role for visual thinkers within the city, really trying to get city government to understand the importance of that role that could be taken by the artists. Currently, again, an idea. Okay, how do you keep this going? The mayor is going to be re-elected. A new mayor is going to be elected. This one is not going to be re-elected again. Fourth time will never happen. Excuse me. There's a new mayor that's going to be elected next November. Maybe it's Ray Lota, the MTA guy, who's maybe he's not interested in sustainability. So I'm really curious, how do you take an idea like this and make it move forward? I'm totally impressed by the grid, which was laid out in 1811 and actually got completed, and nobody stopped it. Somehow that thing just kept on going. Is there some way we can plant a seed like that and keep this idea going forward of transforming Broadway from the Great White Way into the Great Green Way? But the thing that I'm doing is I'm not just presuming this will happen. I'm working with a group of sustainable development, really smart students at Columbia this semester, and we're looking at how we can create a network of institutions, of business improvement districts, of community board members to begin to make a network that will be able to move these ideas forward, sustain this initiative. So we'll see what happens. In the meantime, did I mention I'm doing all of this by myself with my few people in my studio? It's a harebrained scheme, but you know what? That's what artists are good at. So thank you. But can I just, I kept saying I was going to try and get responses from people or interventions. Maybe in the talks that come up, are any of these ideas that we're talking about, or I'm talking about, resonant with people, with you, with your programs? That's something I'd really love to know, but I see somebody in the back.
Well, thanks for coming. It was a pleasure.
May I ask you to speak up for the video camera? So really shout it out because we don't have a microphone to take around.
Thank you for coming. It was a pleasure to hear you.
Great.
Everything you said resonated with all the obstacles that I seem to be challenged with, and I'm sure I speak for many in the room. But I have a couple of questions. One is, in our negotiations in Evansville, with all of our good ideas, we get two responses. One is, what about the vandalism potential? And two, where are your data showing that this can be successful? That either there are studies out there that say X and X show the importance of the arts to the economy or community development. I have no data. So anyway, that's it.
That is really an important question, and I have to say, now that I'm getting these grants, like National Science Foundation grants, it's built into those grants that you have to do evaluations. So for instance, when we did the test at 137th Street, my participant in submitting the grant was he's an environmental psychologist, and his job was to evaluate this. And so he went out and interviewed people before, during, and after the project. So he has this very clear data that shows that incrementally, over a period of time, people did come to understand more and respond to his set of questions in a more informed way. So he's done his report that says, yes, this is working. In Indianapolis, they're still in the process, although we did not have such a complete evaluation for the NOAA project, both the museum and the NOAA grant. Because we had a National Endowment for the Arts grant, that's why these two people did ask for evaluations, although they weren't as thorough as the one at 137th Street. But we definitely have to start doing these and being able to show people the data that says this is working. For instance, somebody in DOT says to me, no, we only want your project up for 3 months. Maybe we'll give you 6 months. What this man saw was that the longer the work was in place, the better the message was understood. So it's not good enough to just put it up for a couple months. It costs too much money, first of all, to do it for just such a short period of time. But you do have to have the come back for them. You do need that. We all need to try and get more of that. As far as vandalism, it is an important issue. But here I am putting this project up in Indianapolis at the same time as one is being installed basically in Harlem, in New York City. I had very little vandalism in the Harlem site. I had terrible vandalism in Indianapolis. Who knew? I didn't know. You know, things are being repaired and rebuilt to, withstand the treatment that was so much rougher than we thought, and certain neighborhoods we can't go back and replace things because even though we felt they were really important places to have, they just can't last. So there has to be a bit of trial and error about what works in your community.
I had a suggestion on what you're trying to do in this last project that you're sharing with us. Can you all hear? And that is that I just heard that the inventor of Twitter, who is now with a new venture called Square, would like to be mayor of New York City. And, if he understands how to communicate with people and rally them, he might be interested in this project. And who knows where that leads. But just,
Anybody got his home phone number? I'd be happy to call him up. Well, one more question. Yeah.
I'm the sustainability coordinator here on campus, and my greatest frustration is that everything we do for sustainability is hidden from people.
Hidden,
when we
right.
put in something new and wonderful, whether it's a water infiltration system or a new LEED building, everyone expects it to look exactly like the old system, which is crazy. If we want a new future, we got to see new things. And so we need to have the designers of these projects work with artists to create a new vision that actually looks different and is still acceptable.
Absolutely. That is the biggest issue. I think people don't understand the money's going, and it's hugely costly to do this work. people have to know that it's happening. It does. It really has to be out there and visible. So I hope we can keep talking about these things during the day. I'm really pleased to be here. Hope to have conversations with many of you. Thank you.